Hi, and welcome to the Deer IQ podcast, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, and we're departing a little bit from our public land series to talk some success stories with a couple guys that I know here in Michigan. And this is going to be a good podcast. We're calling it the No BS session because we're going to try to really dig into the whys of why these hunts really worked out for everyone here. I shot one last week. Cody is joining us. He shot one as well, and so did Mark. And so we're all here in Michigan, and the goal will be to dissect these hunts. I think this will be really beneficial for guys and really, again, analyze the why these things worked. So welcome to the podcast, guys. Cody and Mark, welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, so that's a little different opening than usual, but we'll just dive right in here. And like I said, we all had success recently, and I think it's super important, and I've talked about this quite a bit this year, that if you can figure out the why of why things work or don't work, then you can either replicate those and really increase your success, right, if it went well. If it didn't go well, it's always good to know the why as well, because then you can try to avoid that stuff and not replicate it, right? And so that's what we're looking at here. We're going to look at analysis of the guys. I'm going to have tell the story, probably some good stories in here, and then look at why they made choices they made and why they think it worked out. So we're going to start here with Mark. Tell us about you. So you just shot one on private land here in Michigan. Tell us a little bit about your story with that and the background and how that all worked out.
Sure. It's like you said, it's private. It's a spot I've been hunting for close to 15 years now, and it's what I consider kind of like my best go-to spot. So I've got a lot of history. The quick overview is that it's two different woodlot parcels, basically surrounded by ag. So on the west side of the property, there's a 25-acre woodlot. There's a field in between, and then on the east side, there's like a 12-acre woodlot. And this is just going to focus on the west, which is kind of the main area that I hunt. And a lot of it's actually a story of maybe my lack of preparedness, even though, you know, we talked about a lot of stuff. Well, it was just before season, but I mean, we'd gone through some, you know, preparation points, I think last time we talked, Adam, and in a lot of ways I dropped the ball. And so actually with this hunt, I felt like I was kind of starting on my back foot a little bit. The one thing I had going for me was like perfect conditions for where I hunted. Certainly I'll get into all that. And something that we're very conscious of on this property is zero intrusion until we're ready. So there's, you know, hunters all around. There's, you know, several different property owners all around. We stay out of there. So literally like no one's been back there outside of, you know, the guy who farms it in those ag fields. Zero intrusion in the woods since last year. So that's always a big positive. Basically the hunt goes is,
just so people know, Mark, you recognize Mark if you've listened and watched the podcast. He's been on a few podcasts where we've talked about some of these different points and strategies and things throughout this year. So,
and one of my hunting goals was a strategic sit, strategic hunt on this property. I didn't really have a harvest goal of such a, you know, so big deer, whatever. It was mainly just harvest a mature buck and really be conscious of how and when I hunted and kind of not being a little loose, which I have been in the past, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, I can sit here, the wind's okay, and then I'll get busted. And so the hunt goes as follow. I drove out Friday night. I actually hunted the 12-acre parcel, just a really kind of easy slip in, very low intrusion. And my goal there was really just to kind of see deer behavior and then also try and get a sense of how to enter, like which field to use to get to where I wanted to hunt Saturday. which I was able to get a little info there. I won't touch on the Friday hunt. Saturday, I woke up super early. One thing that I struggle with is rushing to my stand. Even if I wake up, even if I've got time, when I get my stuff on, I'm like, I want to be in stand. And a lot of times I'll rush and get worked up, get sweaty. Like I could shower, I could do all the scent control stuff, and I'll still be sweaty on stand just because I'm pushing to get back there. So I was really conscious about getting in like really quiet, really stealthy, and not being lathered in sweat. So I really took my time, stopped a couple times, looked at the beautiful stars, looked around me. The nice thing about this field, which splits those woodlots, is it was an early ag harvest, and so the deer are not using that. I think it may be literally the first hunt where I never blew a deer getting back to those woods because they're just always out in these ag fields. So I got in really stealthy, got in stand like an hour early. I'm still cold. I'm ready to go. Now, I mentioned that I did not have as much data as I wanted. I really didn't have the intel. And so my goal for the morning sit was actually really kind of an observation sit. And I was about halfway up the woodlot and I was on the downwind side. So I was actually hunting a field edge. So very easy access, great wind conditions. And there was some timber harvest last year in this woodlot. So this particular ladder stand, you actually have really good visibility into the woods. And I've killed a lot of deer from the stand. So there's like a reasonable chance that I might have a shot at something. The whole morning saw a bunch of does and maybe 2 little bucks. Not a lot of chasing, but I got really, really good visual intel on where these does were moving. And that was exactly what I wanted. Because again, hadn't really scouted as much and I didn't have any cameras in there. They were kind of all like off the fields. And so again, just not a lot of intel. That gave me the data that I wanted. And what I hadn't said was like, I'd actually taken, even though I was hunting a ladder stand, I took my mobile setup back there. So I had my climbing sticks, I had my saddle, I had my platform, prepared to make a midday change. And I was planning on, had everything for an all day sit as well. So I was stocked up on water, food, snacks, all that. So I gutted out till lunch and decided at that time, ate my lunch. And I was like, I have enough information to change. And essentially, without really describing the woodlot in too much detail, I was going to slip down closer to bedding about 100 to 150 yards where that ladder stand was, and waited till nothing was around, snuck down, popped back out in the field, shot to the south a little bit, and then I re-entered the woods. And another instance of, I told myself I'm at least going to take an hour to get into the new spot. So I just forced myself to go ultra slow, stalked in, a couple steps. I'd watch around. And so I crept back into this new spot that was a lot closer to bedding and a lot closer to where I was seeing action. Found a good tree and got my saddle set up. And it's like 12:30, 1 o'clock at this point. So I was in early in the morning and I was essentially set up really early for an evening hunt. Horribly early, actually. 7 hours in a saddle was not fun. Got set up, and it probably wasn't until like 4:30 that I saw a deer. So it was a lot of monotony, just waiting, being super bored, trying to pass the time and be comfortable. And I finally started seeing some movement. And pretty early on, I actually saw this nice mature buck. Didn't get a great look at him. He was a ways away. And over the next, that was like probably 5:30. And I saw him probably 5 or 6 times until it was the buck that I ended up shooting, maybe like 5 or 10 minutes of last light. So I was seeing him and he was hanging in this thick bedding. I was actually a little further away than I wanted to be. I was really nervous about bumping stuff. So I had a fairly conservative setup, I would say. I didn't push it. But like I said, conditions were perfect. Wind was perfect. Felt really great about my spot. And I just waited him out, and he was moving around, hanging. I could hear him grunting. He wasn't really pushing does, but he'd kind of nose some around, check some out. And finally at last light, he came down, and I knew he was either going to head west away from me, or if he headed east, I was probably going to get a shot. And for at least like half an hour, he was just nosing, waiting till last light. And finally he ended up coming my way, and I arrowed him at about 20, 25 yards. He ran like 40, 50 and just tipped over. So I watched him die. It was really cool. Heavy rack, not a big rack, probably actually a little bit smaller than this guy, but big body. I put him at 3.5. Nice mature buck. I'd be happy to kill any day of the week. And so it was like 13 hours in a tree. I was tired, sore, like just ready to get out of a tree, but that made it all worth it. And good to move on to so that's kind of the story. So why it worked.
Well, let me interject here for a second. So
sure.
A little more background that I know of. So you don't get to this property much, right? And you're married, you got kids, so your time is kind of limited to hunt this area, right?
Yeah. Compared to before kids and all that, definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
But I usually get a handful of hunts in.
Gotcha. So you were, even though you didn't have intel, you kind of stayed out until this certain time, right? I mean, did this have anything to do with it? Was it just happened to be this weekend that you could hunt, or was it like, okay, I'm kind of timing this out. It's getting toward the end of October. If I'm going to put a all day sit, this is the weekend. Is that kind of your mentality, or what went into all that?
Yeah, that was pretty much it. I mean, if conditions would have been better earlier season, I probably would have been over there like the first 2 weeks of October. And so it was just kind of waiting for the time, obviously, to just be in the woods all day, and then waiting for the right conditions, which typically on that property is, mid to later October.
Right.
Is that because just like with crop harvest and such, that you think they kind of congregate more to that woodlot that you said? Okay. Yeah.
So some of it's, I don't like to hunt when it's really like hot out. If it's hot and muggy, I'll try and stay out till it's a little bit cooler. Crops definitely have a huge influence on that. So like what's planted in which field, when it's coming off, whether it's beans, corn, if they plant like a cover crop in there, deer patterns change like pretty drastically. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you gotta kind of wing it, or not wing it, but it's like last minute changes to the agricultural side of it. Mm-hmm. Can kind of affect your hunting plan. But so really, like, why I think this worked is, even though I didn't have a lot of intel, my plan, the conditions allowed for me to get to a spot where I could gather, and see the deer movement and behavior and patterns pretty quickly in a really super low intrusive way. And then I just made kind of strategic decisions from there on how I moved, where I set up, so that I was still good, wind wise, and I was put myself in a good spot. I think a big reason of why it worked, which in years past I'm pretty guilty of, is that I would say on this hunt, like literally all day, I would say I did not make a mistake. So I was careful with what I did, but I also didn't just go willy-nilly, and I didn't, like from scent control to, like I said, how I accessed, to just being really slow and methodical. I was just really careful, and I stayed within the boundaries of what I could control, and I made sure that I could control it well. And, those inputs, I think, allowed me to have a really good shot at this as far as getting that buck as kind of an output of my efforts.
Yeah, especially when there hasn't been hunting pressure on this property yet, right? And it's like, okay, I'm going in here, but I don't want to be the one to screw it up, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, you went smart about it. You go in and collect data. You didn't pre-decide where you were going, right? I mean, you kind of did as far as, okay, I'm thinking back in this area. I'm going to start here and observe, but that drove your decisions. It wasn't, well, I'm deciding to go back here, right? It was just, I'm going to see and observe and then make my decisions, right?
Right. And obviously there's history there.
Right.
After they'd done some of the timber harvest, I'd walked around in the winter and kind of scouted like where the dozers went, where they'd opened up a lot, where they'd left some bedding areas. So where I ended up hanging my saddle, I'd actually already had a pin like very close from there. And I knew it was a good good spot for the right conditions.
How far was that move you made? You talked about getting down and moving and hanging your saddle. How far of an adjustment did you have to do there?
Yep. As the crow flies, I pinned it about 150 yards from the ladder stand to where I hung my saddle. And one thing that was actually really cool that I hadn't used before last week, and I used it on state land, was the compass feature. I know like none of us are, I don't think, endorsed by Onyx, but obviously it's a really popular. I'm pretty sure we all use it for, mapping, scouting, pinning stuff. The compass feature, so in the ladder stand, I was able to range trees where I saw a lot of deer movement. And the compass mode, you can actually, you can orient your phone, and it points the map, it orients the map in the direction your phone's pointed. It also gives you relative like ticks as far as distances. So I was able to range specific trees to see like how far those does. I was able to look on my map and see kind of relative to where I had pinned previous trees where I'd thought about hanging, and just kind of have a really good position of where I needed to get to. And so when I actually went in to hang the saddle, I just had to do some micro adjustment based on what I saw kind of then and there. But like I said, that put me in a really good spot of kind of knowing where I wanted to be. And it worked out.
Yeah, the no mistakes is huge. Just going super slow and methodical about it. I think that's a huge key there. Not rushing, not making mistakes because you rush, whether it be sweating and scent or noise. Like when you rush, you make a noise. Absolutely. From walking, from your setups, all that stuff. And some people don't realize or overlook that. I mean, one noise could just be it, right? So, yeah, I think that's key, because I personally would rather be super slow and like, oh, some of these guys, you see them posting online about how quick they can get up in their tree, which is great. But if you don't do it super quiet, it doesn't really matter, right? So I personally would rather take half an hour, be really slow, but make zero noise. And when you give yourself enough time, you can do that, right?
Well, especially in a 25-acre woodlot like you're in, like if you're going trouncing through there making a bunch of noise in the midday move, you could easily blow that whole spot out. So yeah, being patient there and just kind of and also utilizing your phone ahead of time, like the resources you had to try to map out how far you got to go and how long it's going to take, and making that move midday and just giving yourself enough time. I think that's probably key there. So,
well, I'm curious to hear your story, Cody, because at least 3 times I thought about, like, after I was up in that tree and I saw where the buck was, I was kicking myself because I was like, I should be another probably 40, 50 yards. Like I should have, I thought I went too conservative with my location. And I thought it was going to bite me, and it very well could have. I mean, he easily, flip a coin. He could have gone the other direction, and a really long day and nothing to show for it. So I thought about actually climbing down and sneaking closer and trying to do like a on the ground setup. But I decided to be patient, wait it out, and yeah, it worked out. So
nice.
Yeah. So, well, before we go to Cody's hunt, Mark or Cody, are there any more takeaways or like ahas from that hunt that you think did it for you? And yeah, you did mention, a potential mistake, but it worked out fine. And that's hard to know sometimes, like how, because if you push it a little bit too much, then that can really bite you too. So,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, 3 quick ones that I jotted down were, give yourself extra time and don't rush. Even if you're behind schedule, I'm super guilty of this. And that's probably the single thing that's bitten me and ruined hunts is that I just rush. Work within your parameters was another one. And, there's a lot hunting you can't control. Focus on the things you can control and kind of, stay in that lane. And I guess that, you could say like, don't push the envelope too far maybe. And then the last one was, I think just like patience, is like, you can't control a deer, put yourself in a good spot and just trust the plan that you set and then learn from it. Right. Even if I hadn't gone far enough, like if that buck never would have walked by, I learned from it and take those and use it in the next hunt.
Yeah, good stuff, Mark. And I will say, judging the weight of your buck, and it's really, I'll show some pictures here if Mark allows, but really heavy horned 8 points. So it's at least a 3, maybe 4-year-old buck. And that's a great buck. So thanks for sharing that, Mark.
Yeah.
Cody, so you have an interesting story too. Let's dive into that here. Tell us about yours and why you think it worked out, because there's a lot that happened for you to be able to get this deer.
Yeah, so the piece of property I was hunting, it's a 40-acre field. It lines up right on the corner of like an intersection with 2 roads. And there's basically a 10-acre swale that kind of meanders through the middle. And when the crops are on the field, it's deer come out of the swales, but primarily they bed across the road. So if you look on a map, it doesn't really set up as what you would look at as a good hunting parcel. But I always put a couple cameras out there and just see what's out there, and usually try to hunt it a few times. And in the story of my buck, it really started in August. I got one picture of this buck skirting the edge of the cornfield, and that was it. And he was a big, tall deer, bigger than normally, like probably the biggest deer I've seen on camera on that property. So he really stood out as a buck I wanted to shoot, but I got no other pictures of him. I had no other intel that he was there. Next to my field is on 3 sides it's soybeans, and they cut all the soybeans in September because it was so dry. They harvested the corn first week of October. So that property was kind of barren. Besides, deer would obviously filter into it in the nighttime to feed and whatnot. But with them bedding across the road to the east, in kind of it's like a grown up pine tree area with a lot of grass and switchgrass. So fantastic bedding, but it's hard to get them to cross the road and come into the field in daylight, especially mature deer, just because there's not much there for them besides food. So they're not really bedded there. And I was actually chasing another buck at the time. I just kind of wrote this spot off for the year with all the crops being off and just not a decent buck on camera in 2 months. So I was up north hunting and chasing another buck, and I got a text from the landowner that has a house right next to my field. And he's like, "Hey, dude, there's a nice buck out in your field." And which could mean a lot of things, right? In Michigan, I'm thinking, is this a yeah, is this like a, a little basket rack 8 point? Like, what are we? So I sent him the picture of that buck. I'm like, it's not this nice, is it? And he goes, no, that's him. I'm like, are you sure? He's like, no, I'm looking at him through binoculars. It's that deer. I'm like, no way. So I drove up north Saturday morning. I hunted Saturday night. I was going to stay up there all weekend. And the property I was hunting, the deer seemed like they were starting to get a little bit pressure to go nocturnal. So I said, you know what? If this deer is daylighting in the field, I got to go hunt him. And so drove an hour and 15 minutes back that night, and just spent the night basically looking on my phone on maps, trying to figure out. I've hunted this property a few years, so I have a general idea of where the deer cross the road and how they enter the field. But I was I could see trails on there, and based on information from the neighbor, I was trying to figure out where this deer was crossing and where he was in the swale, because on this property, there's really only a few trees and they're on the west side of the property. So the deer are bedded to the east across the road, and they never hit that tree line in daylight. So I was basically just crunching the information, and the only thing I came up with is I'm going to have to sit on the ground in the swale to shoot this deer, because he's never going to make it all the way across the field to my tree stand in daylight. So it was a southwest wind, which wasn't ideal, but it set up good enough to where I could sit, and where the deer were coming, they kind of did like an S shape. So they came across the road, and then they would do like an S shape through the swale and pop out. And so it was very tricky with a southwest wind, because if I sat too far to the east, all of these deer, when they were rounded to head and do the beginning of the S shape, they would have all smelled me. But if I was too far to the west, they would have just cut straight across the field, and I would have never had a shot. So I knew going in, I probably had one shot at this, because he was daylighting now. The neighbor ended up saying that his wife saw that same buck in the field a couple days prior. And so I knew he was out in the field, and I didn't know how long that was going to last. Like, how many days was he going to do that before he was back to hitting that at night? So plus that field was going to get disked in a few days. So all that corn stalks were going to get mixed up, and I figured it's now or never. So I went in, first time I'd hunted this property of the year. Got in probably, I didn't get there too early, because I knew there was a west southwest wind most of the day, and then it was changing just to southwest. And I knew if a southwest wind, it was just on the edge of doable. But with a west southwest wind, if I was there for a long time before, my scent was just going to be going all the way through the swale across the road at them. So I waited till I probably had 2.5 hours, and this property is very easy to access. So I got in, walked down the edge of the swale, and the tricky thing I knew was getting in the right spot where I could shoot, because they would pop out of the swale, but then they would walk straight perpendicular to it. So it wasn't like I could just sit on the edge and have a good chance of the deer paralleling the field edge and coming in range. I really had to be in the right spot to shoot when they popped out. And the way I figured that out, because you could see some runways on Onyx and that, but I walked the edge of that swale, and there was probably 6 to 8 runways in a 40, 50 yard stretch. But I didn't know which ones they were using, because I had to be obviously within shooting range of the one they were on, but I wanted to be far enough west I wanted to be as far west as I could, but still shoot this deer, because that would play into my advantage with the wind. So I ended up hopping down into the creek that goes through the swale, and I followed that creek down that 60 yards. And on 2 of the runways up on the hillside, I could see where there was like mud splashed up, and it's been very dry. So I knew those 2 runways were probably hit the day before. And basically I backtracked in the creek, so I was leaving no scent down where they were going to come across. And I basically just tucked into the edge of the swale. I made a little cavity in the grass for myself to sit, and kind of stomped down a couple shooting lanes. And And I just sat there and I waited. I hunkered down and was just trying to stay motionless because I knew there's going to be a bunch of deer that come across, and this deer is probably going to be the last deer to enter this field, and I can't be picked off by any of the deer in front of him, because if they spook, they're going to run back across the road and he's probably not going to come out. And probably 40 minutes before dark, I could hear deer working through the swale, and you'd hear them splash in the creek, and I could hear them come up. And I had does right on top of me. Like they were walking right behind me, about to walk over me, and they ended up skirting like literally 4 to 5 yards off from me, just downwind. And they knew something was up. They were suspicious, but they couldn't pinpoint me. So I think they could slightly smell me, but they were so close that and they could see out into the field past me, that they knew something was wrong, but at the same time, you could tell they were really questioning themselves if they like what it was they were smelling or what they were seeing. And for probably a half hour, they filtered out and they'd get in the field and kind of stare at me and stomp a couple times. And I was just sitting there trying to just stay invisible. And eventually,
and the funny thing is, like, how tall are you, Cody? Like, you're not a little guy.
Little over 6'5".
Yeah, so he's this big guy trying to blend into some grass. So that's quite a feat. Anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just hunched over, and I was just sitting on my knees, like crouched over, and it was uncomfortable. Like my back was getting sore. I was trying to like stretch a little bit. I'm just like, oh man, this is not good. I'm like waiting for this deer. And right when those does got just enough to where they were past me, and I'm like, okay, none of them spooked. It was starting to get dark, and I was starting to get a little bit worried that he wasn't going to show up, because I could see deer on the fence row out in front of me, and a couple of them were crossing. And I remember thinking, I hope he didn't cross at that fence row, because I just remember thinking, I'm probably not going to replicate this sit a second time and get away with what I've gotten away with so far. Like, that's how close I was to getting busted by all of the does that were coming across. I just remember thinking, like, it's got to happen now, because if I come in and try to do this again, they're gonna pick me out. And I could hear another deer coming out of the swale, and I looked over and picked my binos up. I could tell it was a buck, and it was like a 100-inch buck, but I'm like, nah, that's not him. And right behind him, another deer stepped out and picked his head up, and I went, oh, that's him. And I remember, so that day, one thing that I did is I went home. I went to church Sunday, got home, and I practiced shooting from on my knees, shooting like I was going to shoot out of the swale. And I remember when I practiced, every time before I shot, I would pick up my rangefinder, click it, put it down, draw it, and shoot. Because I knew out in the field it can be a little bit tricky to judge distance. But that deer was the only deer that came out into the field and was moving that fast that I picked up my rangefinder and I had to put it down and just draw back, because he was making enough headway where in 5 seconds a 25-yard shot was going to be a 40-yard shot. So I just kind of guessed. I'm like, he's about 25 yards away, and drew back, shot, and I kind of lost my arrow when it hit him. I didn't have a lighted knock, so I shot, and as it went into the deer, it just disappeared, and I could hear the hit. I knew it was a solid hit. Like, I'd obviously hit him, and it wasn't like a shoulder hit or anything like that. And then he took off running, and he stopped out in the field a little bit, and I was watching him through binos, waiting for him to fall over. And he kind of just walked around a little bit. I could tell him, like, he's obviously hit, but he mixed with some deer. And then at that point, darkness fell upon us, and I was just sitting there, and there was deer still out all over the field. So I couldn't move. I couldn't get out of there. I was just sitting there trying to listen. And eventually, like, probably 45 minutes passed, and I said, all right, I got to get out of here. And so I grabbed my stuff and I snuck down the edge, and I went out, kind of out to the road, and then walked around to my truck, which is the opposite of how I accessed, just because I didn't want to spook those deer. And then yeah, went out the next day, and ended up finding him, and yeah, it was a nice deer. So I was super happy. I was telling Adam, like, this is the first time I've had a deer picked out, and I said, I'm going to sit here to shoot this deer because he is going to do this. And that happened to the exact script. I got him. So it was definitely rewarding. And, yeah, he's a nice big 8-point. And, yeah, so.
Yeah, nice job. Congrats on that. So, why? There's a lot of stuff in there. First of all, a lot of things. You're right. They had to come together just right, or it was over. Right. You got a lot of good intel. And I'll let you do this, but that's one thing that pops out to me. Like, you had very specific, timely intel, and you acted on it, right?
Yep.
You had a lot of stuff there, but what are some keys you think? Like, these things had to happen. This is why this worked.
The first thing that had to happen is I knew I had to act right away, because it's, at this point, this was a week or so ago. It's like in the, the typical October lull. And this deer has been seen in the field twice in daylight. So I knew I had to make a move quick, but I knew I couldn't play it very safe. It crossed my mind. Do I go sit in the tree line and glass with binos, watch this deer come out, and then try to like stage along the swale until I'm close enough? But then I said, I don't know if I've got three hunts at this deer. Like, he could easily just start showing up a half hour after dark, all like routinely. So one of the key things was I had to go hunt this deer now. Like, he's in daylight 2 of the last 4 days. I've got to go make a play on him right now. The other key thing was being very particular about where I set up, to where the wind, like, I was just off wind. Like, that deer, when he came across the pine trees, walked through that swale with the thermal sucking down towards him and the southwest wind, that buck thought he could smell everything in front of him, because he's walking through the swale. The thermals are coming down. He's headed to this field over here. The wind's coming right out of that field at his face. Like, he felt like he had the advantage, but I was just enough upwind that when he made that turn of that S shape that he was going to do, I was like, had he walked another 15, 20 yards, he would have picked me off. But I was just on the fringe of an unfavorable wind. And that was key, because we had a southwest wind the last several days, and I didn't know if he was only coming out in daylight because of that wind, and he felt like he could make a move in daylight because he's entering the wind, versus another wind, he might show up at daylight. So being as close as I could to pushing that line of being smelled, but having to be that close to get a shot when he popped out this swale, because he'd pop out and he's headed southwest straight away from there to feed across the field. So if I played it safe, I'm not going to be close enough to shoot him. But if I play it too far, he's going to smell me. So there was a small little window of maybe 15 yards that I had to sit within this 400-yard swale to get that deer. So that was a key thing in itself, just dissecting, like, where is this deer going to pop out?
Yeah, I think that is key, and guys might not always think about it. Is just, what is good for the deer, right? And like you said, is he repeating this because, I saw these behaviors on these conditions, so if I get these conditions again, he's likely to repeat that. That's a good indication. And then, that he felt, I always have probably the best success when the deer think things are in their favor and they actually aren't. So that's a real big key. Anything else there, or Mark, anything pop out to you about that hunt?
I mean, the first thing is like, man, you owe your neighbor a big thank you too.
I already told him.
Yeah.
I said, hey, if you need dose or anything like that, I said you can go shoot him, because I said
that's a really, really good neighbor to text you like that. Who, yeah,
because like I said, I had
that's so cool.
Yeah, I had one picture of that deer. So, and what he was doing, it makes sense because there's a pond on the southwest corner of that field, and that dried out in September. And so usually where my camera is, they'll come across the field and go to that pond, and I'll pick them up on camera. Well, I never moved my camera or nothing. And what he was actually doing is he was just walking straight through that swale, going across the bean field to like a little bit of a gravel mine where there was water. And yeah, it never, like, I just had my camera there. I hadn't been out there. Wasn't out there. I didn't move it or anything like that. And he was evidently there, but just having one picture of him, I thought, this is just a buck in the summer. That's maybe, before shedding velvet, he's roaming around, checking out a few areas, and then he's back in his core area. So there was a little bit of me that said maybe around the rut time, this deer might come back, like a day or two, chasing some does or something through the swale. But yeah, that's what I mean. If the neighbor didn't say something, I would have never known. And I told him that too. Like, I found the deer, he came over and he actually helped me drag it out, and he was just as fired up as I was. He was so happy. He's like, man, it's just cool to be part of this. And yeah, really, really great people. And yeah, I'm glad they said something, because I would have been up north, hunting deer that were a little bit too nocturnal.
So how far off the road were you? You said it's 40 acres. Is that square?
Yep.
So it's quarter mile square?
Yep. It's a 40-acre square. So I was kind of near the center of that 40. So the swale dumps through the middle. And then I was basically in the middle. So, yeah, they had to, but that's where, and I don't know if we're able to show maps or something on this, but we could show the map if that helps. But yeah, he basically, they'd work through this swale and they'd follow it a certain way. And when they would get to a point where the swale kind of bottlenecks down, that's usually where they pop out. But they pop out a lot of different spots too. So I really had to, and that's where getting in the creek and actually walking the creek and seeing which trails had been hit probably that night, with having some mud that was still wet splashed up on the banks. If I didn't do that, I probably would have sat further than I did, because I basically, like I said, there was probably like 6 to 8 runways that were in that area. And he was coming out. He came out of the one runway I picked, and I said, I think he's probably going to use this one, but there was 2 of them that were pretty close. Had I not walked the creek and found that sign that was indicated those 2 runways were freshly used, I probably would have set up 10 yards off of that last runway furthest west, which would have put me like 20 yards away. I would have been further than I would have wanted to shoot at this deer. So that was one of the other key things, I think, is just having intel, but then also making decisions in the field, like doing a little mini scouting session before I just popped down to really try to dial in where I needed to be, like the spot within the spot that I had to sit to have a chance at this deer. So
good stuff. Yeah, it's what we call high IQ there, Cody. Mm-hmm. Any other takeaways there before we go to our break here? From Cody or Mark?
The only thing I would say is that was the first deer I shot from the ground, and I've hunted from the ground before and had deer come in close, and it's always a rush. So I would, if there's people out there that haven't tried it, I would say do it. I think with the mobile hunting, we get caught up in like, the latest tree stands and saddles and gear and such. And it's like mobile hunting also means being on the ground and making a move when you have to on the ground. Like if you've got a buck that you can't get in a tree stand, like there's a lot of guys I know that have shot good ones from the ground too. And it's, I think a little bit overlooked.
So here is our high IQ moment for today. So the high IQ moment is to take the new and enhanced Deer IQ test. If you haven't taken that yet. The old one was a fun 10-question test, but this one is much more detailed, and actually, and Mark's taken it, it really helps you see your strengths and weaknesses. It's kind of a mirror of sorts, right? And so if you really want to know your blind spots, where you really can improve best, this is a great tool to do that. And I want to read a quote from somebody that just took it here. So this is from Paul. He says, if you're serious about improving your hunting skills, take the Deer IQ test and consultation. Don't just listen to endless podcasts or YouTube videos. Get real, honest feedback on what your strengths and weaknesses are. This is a great value, and you will learn how to actually improve your hunting. And so that is something you can do. It's linked below. And it's really just kind of an eye-opening type thing. If you're really serious about your hunting, go ahead and take that. All right. Now it's my turn here. So last weekend, we had a little... I think there were 6 or 7 of us at a bow camp out in public land, right? And this is high pressured. We saw tons of hunters. Mark went. Cody stopped by, but he couldn't stay. But high pressure, right? We saw so many hunters and stuff. But there's some decent deer there. And I was able to take a buck Saturday night. And this story, and so this was, for me, my criteria here in Michigan is a 3.5-year-old buck. I don't really put a score on that, but that's a pretty good goal if you're hunting public land mostly, which is what I do. And so he was a good 7 point, a 3.5-year-old buck. But this was really a story a couple years in the making, and kind of the background on this was, and I talked about this a while back, I think with Mark on a podcast. A couple years ago, I found a spot that was not too far off the road that had all this sign, and it was really overlooked. And last year, I put a camera in there. I made some mock scrapes, and I got a lot of pictures of some pretty good bucks, including one nice 8-point last year, but I never hunted it. I was going after other deer in other areas, and I just got some data from a handful of bucks in this area. Well, come this year, I did some more scouting in this area, and I was able to find a spot I thought they were bedding that was maybe 150 yards away. There was thicker cover and also overlooked, and found some sign over there as well that made me think, okay, this is maybe a place I can hunt and take one of these deer, right? And so this year, I made some mock scrapes. I put a camera in there, and I was getting, in the summer and really early fall, a handful of bucks in daylight hitting these scrapes. And so that's where I started hunting this year. And usually I try to have multiple spots. I try to have, just take the data for what it is to hunt early season. But I was getting a real good picture of several bucks in there, and one especially that I was pretty sure was that 8-point from the year before that was now 9-point. He's just a really, really nice buck. And so I started hunting that, and the first few hunts, I passed up a decent buck in there, but didn't see this buck that I was hoping to see. But as I was hunting it, I could tell that I was putting a little pressure on it. And I don't like to hunt a spot more than once or twice, but I was hunting it more and more because I had this historic data telling me that this buck daylighted mid-October in this area. So I was trying to, put this together without pressuring it, but felt like kind of was. Anyways, from hunting it, I could kind of tell a little bit more, kind of like Mark did, how they were actually using this area. And I could tell kind of to the east, I was hearing, chasing, I was hearing more movement over there. And also I was trying to put together the pieces of the buck always entering from the west side. And I was kind of sandwiched in between those two things where I was setting up. And so I have this trail camera data. I have this data that I'm getting from in the field hunting. But I just felt like that spot, even though they were hitting those scrapes, was just getting used less and less. And so here comes this, the weekend of the camp. And so I decided to basically scout around this area and figure out if there's a different way I could approach it. Because I knew that bucks were still using it. I didn't have any real recent intel like Cody did as far as this buck. And actually another bigger one that showed up on camera probably a couple weeks prior to that weekend. But I didn't have any real current stuff to tell me, okay, right now they're doing this. So I scouted around this bedding hub, I'd call it, this really thick bedding area where it seemed like a lot of this activity was, and found a spot one afternoon and prepped that. And it was, as a crow flies, about 170 yards from where I had been hunting. It was on the edge of it. It was a spot kind of between two bedding areas. It was just the open spot where they kind of traveled through, but it was still quite a bit of cover. And the funny thing is I actually had a tree stand in this tree about 8 years ago. So I did have that history with it, and I hadn't really hunted it since. I kind of just left it be. And I didn't even realize that was that spot until I got in there and, realized how close it was. And so I hunted around it a bit one night. I hunted down at the far end, the west end of this section. And then I worked my way back and wound up finding this spot. Put a couple mock scrapes in there, and then, got ready for that evening hunt. And so I went out that night, and kind of like Mark, I really crept my way in there. And there was two other guys in the parking lot at this spot. So there's always this you don't know factor of where the other guys are, what they're going to be doing, how they're going to potentially screw it up, right? But making sure I didn't screw it up. So I just super slow walk in there, and super crunchy, little wind but not much. And I'm just slowly going in, and I get close to those scrapes, and a deer bounds off that was right there. I mean, right by those scrapes, right by my stand. And so I just, again, probably took me half an hour to go 80 yards to get in there and slowly set up. And that turned out to be a doe was still right there. And she wound up snorting once because she wasn't very far into that really thick bedding cover. But it finally got set up, right? I didn't get set up till 5, which was kind of late, I felt. But again, it took me forever to get in there, but just being really slow and methodical because I was so close to where I thought they were bedding. Literally 20 yards, from my stand is where this thick stuff starts, and that's where they were. So as quiet as I could, I get up with my mobile set up, and early probably about 5:30, so there's about half an hour after I'm set up, I see a buck walking through, or a deer. I could tell it was a buck, couldn't tell what. I grunt at it. It winds up circling around. It's a smaller 6-point. And then as I'm watching him, I hear something else, and that's where this buck steps out. And I could tell it was an older buck, at least 3.5. I could tell it was a shooter. Wound up drawing once when he was further off, but I just didn't have a good shot. So I let him be, and he just kind of fed through that area, but I had to have him come really close for me to get a shot. And so I just had to be real patient, let him he just kind of racked up some scrub brush that was in there, and he finally just wandered over by those scrapes, which I don't even think he knew they were there because I just put him there. But he stuck his nose in that scrape and wound up giving me a shot. And the shot was probably not the best shot. He was kind of taking a step as I shot, and he bounded off, and I wound up letting him go overnight. And there's a long story with the track job too, but I will say with some good tracking, wound up finding this buck, and I guess that's the summary of my hunt. And it isn't the buck that I was there hunting, but it was a buck that definitely met my criteria, especially for public land. And so that was, I'd say, a great hunt. It was a great recovery. I had some help. Mark was one of the guys that helped with that. The track job, this buck double backed, and there was a lot of meticulous tracking involved to finally find this buck, even though he only went, I think I looked at probably about 150 yards straight. He did a lot of weaving around and stuff. So anyways, that's kind of where that all came together for me. And really, like I said, a couple years in the making. Takeaways on that for me was, first of all, this was the first sit. And I'll just bring that up about everybody's hunt here. It was a first sit for every person. And that just is the highest odds thing you can do, right? It's the most surgical, I'll say, thing you can do when you can put a lot of thought into it. You have the reasons why you're doing it. You have as much intel as possible to do it. Your odds are just much, much higher. And that's what this was. Even though it was 170 yards away, I was hunting basically the same spot. It was from a different angle. It was the first sit in that spot. And the deer felt very comfortable and it was the right spot to be, right? And that came together. So that was a big, big thing, I think, in that case for me. Another thing was, which I'd say I wish I had a little better, was the data, right? My data was a little old as far as what I was acting on. So I like to have data that's fresh, like Cody's, this buck was here yesterday. I didn't have that, and I was looking for that when I scouted. I just never got it. So the best I could do was go off historical type data, which I'd say, on a scale of 1 to 5 that I kind of use was about a 3, which is not great, but it's decent, right? Especially that historical data.
Yeah, and I think that's where it pays off, just being in a good spot in general. So you did your scouting, you found the spot, you got some info. It was a good spot to hunt, but it sounds like the deer maybe shifted what they were doing a little bit, and you were able to work off of that spot and just kind of figure out where they had shifted to. And that could be from several things. Like, one, just pressure in general. Maybe there's other guys out in that spot that are kind of walking through there to access certain areas and pushing them around. Or two, just year to year browse, drought, different conditions. Like, maybe they just shifted. So that's good that you were able to track that down, though, and kind of find where they're at. And just being in a good spot, you're able to see a nice buck and shoot it, even though it's not the buck you're after per se, but that's where just being in the right area with some good sign pays off.
Yeah, I think another, just being able to analyze what you're taking in, right? And in this spot too was not a huge spot. I'd say it's maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 acres where they really were bedding and using it. And it really was focused and concentrated in this area. And so it's just finding those type of areas, which again, wasn't very far to access, but they were just in that spot, and is just really drilling down, I guess, and finding that and making good decisions based on your data.
It was interesting to see that spot, actually. I didn't pin it, don't worry. But just from some of the stuff that you've talked about, and then, boots on the ground always obviously looks different. And, it was just a little spot in kind of seemingly big timber that, maybe one commonality would be kind of almost like micro terrain, even like in each one of our hunts, of just like, generally speaking, a lot of Michigan's kind of flat and boring, but you can break that down. And sometimes really, really small terrain features can make a big difference in terms of movement when, the landscape is seemingly kind of bland. using a creek, using that, little terrain funnel that Cody did, or a little section of bedding, whatever. So I like that you did, you found like that little corridor, and then you also kind of created some luck by putting a mock scrape in, is I think really helpful too, of like trying to, ignite some stuff or what uses that.
Yeah, for sure. And we could probably dissect all these more, but those are just some things to think about, guys. I'd say the theme for all of us, if I could just kind of boil it down and takeaways here as we wrap up, takeaways would be the really putting a plan together. Like these were really thought out. We had various levels of data to go off of, from Cody's being like the hot data to where I'd say that's a 5 data where something's daylight active in where you can shoot them, to me and Mark maybe 3 or 4 where Mark had to kind of get it as he went, right? But really being thoughtful about your plan and then reading the sign as it came to you to make those good decisions. And again, the power the first time in, and really timing that and knowing how valuable that is so you don't waste it, are a couple big things. So again, congrats, guys. Thanks for sharing that. Hopefully you listening got something good out of these and can, I guess, apply and think about your hunts and your situations, how you can do similar. And thanks for listening to this episode. Is a little different than usual, a little more winging it, I guess, than usual. But again, thanks, guys, for joining. And next time, join us. We're continuing the public land series. We have the guest. My guest is Michael Vane, who's been an outdoor writer for decades and decades. He's going to talk about hunting on public land in pressured areas, but also areas that are really hard to hunt. And he hunts a lot in the UP of Michigan. So that's going to be a good episode. So stay tuned and listen for that next week.